Welcome to this week's episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. On this week's episode, we look into how Israel doesn't need the United States anymore. Let's get started. For many of my regular listeners, you might remember from our last few episodes, we've started this sort of unintentional series of debunking falsehoods from the other side of the argument. I often talk about the trolls in the comment section who like to post quotes from Zionist leaders or indigenous claims of the Palestinian Arabs. And recently, I've been trying to debunk these in order to not only help you defend yourself in the comment section, but also just to understand the history a little bit better so you can be more educated on this very complex issue. And for this week's episode, the claim I want to debunk with facts and reality is the fact that so many trolls out there love to use the claim Israel wouldn't exist if it wasn't for the United States, implying that it's only because the United States gives them money and weapons and supports them and is their big brother. That's why Israel exists. And is this true? We're about to find out. First, we can start with the obvious reality of the situation, which is currently the United States and Israel are very close allies. And the United States does, in fact, help and support Israel in many ways. But was that always the case? Is it true that Israel only exists today because the United States is helping them? To figure this out, we have to go back to the beginnings of the modern state of Israel, which, as you all know, was in 1947-1948. Just prior to the announcement and the reestablishment of the State of Israel, many countries around the world didn't care for Israel all that much. Sure, obviously a lot of countries voted for the partition plan in the UN, which included the United States, but did they really support the State of Israel? Because as every newspaper at the time was saying, the Arab world was pretty clear what would happen if the Israelis declared a state in the land, and they made good on their promise. So just prior to the war that would inevitably happen once the British left, the Jewish people of the land attempted to create and gain an army. Unfortunately for the Jews of the land, nobody wanted to sell them any weapons, mainly because nobody wanted a conflict in the Middle East. A world that had just got out of World War II. This is only a few years after the entire world was embroiled in a terrible war costing millions of lives. The world wanted to be finished with wars. And here you have essentially the Arab armies, all funded by the British and other colonizing forces who gave them an army, were saying that they would start a war with the state of Israel if it became a country. So rather than allowing another world war to happen years after the last world war, many of the Western countries really didn't want to fund Israel and give them any weapons. They didn't want to have another world war, and they also kind of thought the Israelis were going to lose, so why send weapons to them to just kind of be destroyed anyway? It's a big waste of money. Money that many countries didn't have considering they had just got out of a war. The United States even went further and did an official arms embargo against the state of Israel. They literally banned weapon sales to the Jewish state. The Jewish people at the time had to do all kinds of incredible things in order to get the weapons they needed for the eventual war. The biggest supplier of their weapons was Soviet Czechoslovakia. There were many cases of American Jews and Jews around the world from various countries set up various shell companies and bought weapons from people who couldn't sell them to Israel in order to secretly send them to the state of Israel. And this was the only way that they were able to survive. According to some reports, the figure is somewhere around one weapon for every 3 Jewish fighters in 1948. And just as a reminder, these are against the biggest Arab armies who were all given the newest and best technology from places like France and England. They had been trained for many years, ready to fight. And then you have some Israeli Holocaust survivors and locals who are mainly farmers and shopkeepers fighting against professional armies with next to no weapons. And by some miracle, Israel succeeded at defeating all of those Arab armies. So for this first war, the talking point of Israel wouldn't exist if it wasn't for the United States clearly is made up out of whole cloth, considering the fact that they had an actual arms embargo against selling any weapons to Israel. So let's call that 0 for 1 for the anti-Israel haters, because 1948 was definitely not won because the United States was helping. As many of my listeners know, 1967, 1973 were two other major conflicts where the Arab armies attacked the state of Israel. And therefore, surely these wars would have the United States coming to the help of the Israelis, since we wouldn't exist if it wasn't for the United States. Some of you might be a little surprised to find out that the United States policy in the 1950s didn't change much from the 1940s. They didn't really support sending any weapons or support to the state of Israel. Under the American President Truman, he felt that he didn't want to create an arms race in the Middle East. So by providing weapons, support, or money to the Israelis, you are funding essentially another arms race between all of the Arab world and the Israelis. So in his thinking, if we don't supply any weapons to the Israelis or any money to create weapons, we won't have this arms race. So Israel was forced to go to the only country that would really sell them weapons, which was France. So the Israelis were getting planes and weapons from France, in addition to the ones that they were trying to invent and build themselves. Since not many people would actually sell the Israelis weapons, the Israeli manufacturing community came together and created some of the best weapons that Israel could design. Most of you guys know the Desert Eagle and the Uzi. All of these really amazing guns were created out of requirement because the Israelis couldn't rely on any other country to sell them weapons. Everything was done somewhat in-house. Unfortunately for the Americans, though, this didn't last very long, this not helping Israel situation, because they were also very concerned during the height of the Cold War that the Arab armies were going to go to the Russians and get weapons. So this idea that we can prevent an arms race simply by not supporting either side was short-lived, because the Russians were more than happy to send the Arab armies tons of their finest weaponry. So the United States decided not to supply Israel with weapons, which is what some of the trolls would like you to believe. They only provided defensive weapons to the state of Israel, anything that could be used to defend against the Russian weapons, but nothing for offense. It wasn't until 1962 that the Americans first started sending anti-aircraft weaponry to take down Russian planes and Russian missiles. There were some back channels supposedly through West Germany that allowed the Israelis to get weapons from Germany that were not unsanctioned by the United States. But let's just say that the Israelis were not exactly supported wholeheartedly by the Americans. And yet, somehow, the Israelis still destroyed all of the Arab armies in 1967 without the help of the United States. And as the end of the Six-Day War happened, the Arab armies who had been destroyed turned back to Russia for more weapons. And sure enough, Russia is more than happy to sell it to them. And that is what causes the United States to now, unfortunately for them, get a little bit more involved. We have a full-on proxy war where the Israelis are getting American weapons and the Arab armies are getting Russian weapons. Towards the end of the 1960s, around 1968, the United States Congress approves the sale of American-made weapons to Israel and other countries in the region. The reason being that they felt the only way to counter the Soviet Union Russian weapons entering the Arab world is to sell them American weapons. So they really didn't care about protecting Israel as much as they cared about stopping the Soviet Union or Russia from sending those weapons in. So let's not pretend here that this was some sort of ideological reason they were sending weapons because they support and want Israel to exist and because they are hoping to colonize the region. This was a matter of dollars and cents. Our enemies are selling tons of weapons over there. We don't like it, and so we want them to use our weapons instead. So let's sell it to everybody in the region. Countries that received American weapons at the same time was Lebanon, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia. It really wasn't until the 1970s during the Yom Kippur War, when the Arab armies used their Russian-made weapons in order to surprise attack the State of Israel. And out of necessity, the United States facilitated the transfer of weaponry to the State of Israel, who was trying to defend itself. So can we say that the United States protected Israel during the Yom Kippur War? Honestly, I think it helped, but I don't think the Israelis were really supported so much that they would have not won if it wasn't for the Americans, as the trolls will say. In fact, it wasn't until 1984 that the Americans and the Israelis officially signed an agreement to work together militarily for a mutual benefit for both countries. The Israelis were now officially allowed to buy weaponry from the United States, and the United States uses Israeli territory to run drills, to keep stockpiles of weaponry that they might need in the Middle East, and it's an agreement between the two countries for mutual protection and support. Over many years, that becomes a much more closer relationship and more money involved, and we can get into that in a minute. But if you look simply at the history of this conflict and of this situation, you can easily see that the United States had very little to do with the success of the State of Israel. The claims made by these trolls online that Israel wouldn't exist if it wasn't for the United States is purely fiction, considering the fact that they didn't help in 1948, they didn't really help in 1967, they sort of helped in 1973, but Israel did all of this stuff on their own, or at least without the help of the United States. It really wasn't until after the 1970s, after all of the wars were done in the Middle East, that the United States and Israel created this very tight bond that we see today. So the claim that Israel relies on the United States to exist is kind of debunked. Now, this is not to say that the current situation in Israel isn't a different story. The United States and Israel are notoriously close, and Israel gets tons of weapons from the United States. So if we look into that now, maybe that's where the truth lies in this claim that they're making. So if we look at all of the modern statements that are being made in newspapers, on college campuses, that Israel is getting so much weaponry, so much money, the US should stop funding Israel, all of these lies. Because they aren't actually sending money to Israel. They send credits. What the United States has decided to do over some time now is rather than send cash to go buy weaponry, they give them credits to buy American weapons from American factories and therefore helping the American economy, which is, I hate to say, great for the Americans, but not so great for Israel. When it first started, Israel received foreign military financing, aka credits, from 1988 to 1990 that allowed them to spend about 26% or $400 million in Israeli factories on Israeli weapons. The rest must be used in America on American weapons. This number hasn't changed all that much. That less than 20% of the money given to Israel for weapons is spent outside of the United States or in Israeli factories. It makes Israel reliant on the United States. But does this really show some type of favoritism towards Israel from the United States? Because between the years 1950 to 2022, Israel has been second to Saudi Arabia with how many weapons they get from the United States. Israel also gets the exact same amount as Japan, almost as much as Taiwan, just a little bit more than Australia, South Korea, and even Egypt and Qatar. So this idea that United States is somehow backing Israel over everybody else really doesn't show in the numbers, as many other countries, even within the Middle East, are getting relatively the same amount of money as the Israelis for weaponry. I'm not sure if anyone would say that Japan wouldn't exist if it wasn't for the Americans, or Australia. So why is it that people say that just because Israel pays for weapons from the United States, somehow they wouldn't exist if it wasn't for those weapons? The numbers really don't stack up. And unlike many other countries around the world who get similar amounts of money from the Americans to buy American weapons, as opposed to, let's say, Russian or others, is that the Israelis work with the Americans to develop these weapon systems in many cases. The two countries often work on joint projects that allow them to split the costs of these new platforms that they can then both use. there are likely not as many deals and arrangements between, let's say, Japan and the United States or Australia and the United States. So it is mutually beneficial that USA and Israel work together on these weapons systems. And this aid that they are getting, or credits, is not for nothing. It is for working together towards the same goal, which is a peaceful and stabilized Middle East, and world for that matter. Because don't forget that the people in the Middle East who hate Israel also very clearly hate the United States. And so Israel really is that buffer zone that allows the United States to stay somewhat peaceful and comfortable on the other side of the world. So the weapons systems that Israel creates will eventually help the Americans. The intelligence sharing that the United States needs from the Middle East that Israel gets helps the Americans. It really isn't for nothing, unlike all of the other people in the region who get weapons for nothing. There are some out there who have called out this relationship between Israel and the United States in a negative way. It seems to be that there are more and more Israeli commentators and influencers who are speaking out very openly against the relationship between the United States and Israel, especially when it comes to this aid and weaponry. As you can see from this previous few minutes on this podcast, the current situation between Israel and the United States is a very difficult one. Israel has signed on to this agreement to spend most, if not all, of their money on U.S. weapons, and they're not even able to develop their own weaponry like they used to in the past. And Israel also cannot legally spend this money anywhere else in the world on any other weapons, and they're forced to continue to go back and rely on the United States. And this, unfortunately, many people will point out, is a very negative thing for the Israelis, who are at the whim of whatever government is in power at that very moment. And since October 7th, we've seen what happens when an American administration decides to, let's say, not be as supportive of Israel. We've seen them slow roll selling stuff to Israel, not shipping it, or even saying they won't sell certain weapons at all. And Israel is not allowed to go somewhere else to go get it, or even make it themselves. So some would suggest that the United States has put a leash on Israel, and this aid money, if stopped, would take that leash off of Israel and allow them to make their own decisions on the way that they can best defend themselves. In the end, you can see how this talking point that is often used, that Israel only exists today because of the United States, can be very easily debunked if you know the history. You can also see that even if we look at today's facts on the ground, that United States does in fact help Israel a lot more than it did in the initial days of Israel, it still doesn't justify the fact that Israel supposedly wouldn't exist if it wasn't for the United States. We have seen various governments in the United States turn pretty hard against the state of Israel. Not to pick on the last democratic government in the United States, who was calling out Israel every chance they got. We talked about that a lot on the podcast. Clearly, Israel still exists despite the fact that the United States wasn't their best ally at the time. And meanwhile, as the United States has its back and forth with Israel on how much they support them or don't, there are many other countries who get as much or more aid than the Israelis when it comes to weaponry. But nobody's claiming that these countries are only in existence because of the United States. This talking point, it seems, is trying to do a few things. First of all, is trying to explain why the Arab world continues to lose war after war after war to the Israelis. Because it can't just be that you guys suck at war or that the Israelis are actually good at their wars. It has to be because some big, powerful country is doing it for you. Whatever helps them sleep at night, knowing that they keep losing to the Jews. And the other thing that this talking point is trying to project is that Israel is a colonizer state, which we talked about on a previous podcast. That Israel is somehow a satellite colony of the United States. And therefore, if it wasn't for the big, bad United States backing up their colony, their white European colony, it wouldn't exist. They're trying to present the modern-day state of Israel as simply a Western colony of the United States and therefore not indigenous, which we know is another one of their talking points. Except this couldn't be further from the truth, considering the United States had a pretty negative policy towards Israel all the way up through its history until the 1980s. And you could think about that every single time they use this fake talking point, trying to claim that the United States is the only reason why Israel exists today and has continued to exist for 75 plus years. Just understand where it's coming from. These attempts to paint Israel as a colonizer state, a satellite of the United States, and also to explain why they just can't quite beat the Israelis, why every war ends up being the Jews succeed and the Arabs lose, which is really funny because that's exactly what happens every time I make a comment reminding the trolls of the fact that they keep losing wars to Israel. And their response is, inevitably, well, if you didn't have the United States, you wouldn't survive. But the reality is, Israel doesn't and never has needed the United States in order to survive. This has been another episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. Don't forget to check us out on social media at jdr.podcast and check out some of our other episodes on your favorite podcast source. We'll see you next time.